morning, everyone. My name is Catherine Perez-Estolano. I'm from Arup, and we are happy to have you here at the Verde Exchange ULI 2018. This has been such a great day and a half of discussions yesterday at Verde and now today with Future Build, and we're very just the conversations and discussions that are happening around all kinds of issues. And as you saw in the opening session, a lot of opportunities in Los Angeles happening with the Olympics and investments that are happening. And it's a very exciting time. So we are very lucky to have such a dynamic panel today. Transit Hub, Kate, sorry, wrong panel. I'm like, that's Rick's panel. How will autonomous vehicles change the way we think about cities? And this is, for me, the movement and pace of change is so rapid. And so we have some phenomenal people with us today to have a conversation to discuss from their perspective and their knowledge about where we are with things. Our first, I'm going to introduce, the way we're going to do this is because we have such a limited time and we have amazing speakers, is I'm just going to very quickly introduce everybody, and then we're going to go straight into questions and hopefully leave a little time on the backside for questions from the audience. We have Melanie Nutter, principal of Nutter Consulting, that provides sustainability and smart city strategy development for implementation for cities, foundations, and companies. She was appointed by Gavin Newsom as the director of the San Francisco Department of Environment and continued in that capacity under the former mayor, Ed Lee. She joins us today from San Francisco, and so we're very, very happy to have her join us. We also have Justin Ehrlich. He is the global head of policy for autonomous vehicles and urban aviation from Uber. Before that, he was an advisor to Senator, was it candidate or Attorney General Kamala Harris, thank you. And he also had has worked at McKinsey & Company. Thank you very much. You also join us from San Francisco. We are lucky to have our wonderful general manager from LADOT, Salita Reynolds, who we took from San Francisco, and we're excited to have her. She was previously at the San Francisco Municipal Transit Agency running the Livable Streets section, and that experience, having worked in San Francisco, has proved to serve us incredibly well. We're lucky to have Salita join us, and Vince Bertoni. He is the Director of Planning for the City of Los Angeles. He has a deep history in Southern California, having worked in Pasadena, Beverly Hills, Santa Clarita, and just a fantastic discussion we're going to have with the four of them about these issues and how they kind of relate to the future of cities. So, with that background, the big question right now for autonomous vehicles, right, there's a lot, but the first one that kind of comes to mind is really the public rights of way. How will we use and access public facilities going forward? What is the future for streets and curbs and pricing, and who gets to use them? The redefinition of public rights of way is underway. So maybe we'll throw that quickly over to Salita about this, because I think she has a few thoughts about that.
I do have a few thoughts. Thank you so much, Catherine. I really appreciate you moderating and getting us queued up for the conversation. So I'm assuming now, because it's almost impossible to open up any publication and not read somebody's hot take on autonomous vehicles, that there's a general knowledge in the crowd of sort of what AVs are, where they are now. You have companies like Waymo, who put the first car on the street without a driver after millions of miles of testing. And you have companies like Tesla that are continuing to release autonomous packages to vehicles currently on the road. So there's sort of a wide range of sort of approaches out there. On the one hand, going straight to no driver, no steering wheel. On the other hand, gradually iterating towards full autonomy. And we've spent a lot of time, both the city of LA and also in my role as president of the National Association of City Transportation Officials, NACTO, thinking about what the street of the future will look like and how we can best take advantage of the opportunity in front of us. When the internal combustion engine showed up on our roads 50, 60, 70 years ago, we let our cities be rebuilt in service of a very inefficient way of moving people around them. We have an opportunity now to have the technology serve the needs of the city, but it is not clear yet that things are headed in that direction. There's a bill currently under consideration in the U.S. Senate that would preempt states and cities from doing all kinds of regulation on our local streets and roads in service of allowing manufacturers to test and deploy their vehicles on our streets without telling us or engaging anybody in cities. So there's a real sort of tension there about who the streets are for and what the street of the future ought to look like. In October, NACTA released a blueprint for autonomous urbanism, which laid out a vision of connected and electric and autonomous and shared vehicles that really extend the reach of public transit. They're small, lightweight, slow, safe, shared vehicles to extend the reach of high-capacity rail and subway in our city. And when we approach things that way, what we do is unlock streets as public space, and maybe we don't have to use them for traffic all day, all the time. And even though this is a somewhat utopian vision, actually a couple of months later, Lyft, in partnership with Perkins Will and Nelson Nygaard, put out a very similar vision. So there are some sort of shared visions in the public and private sector about what autonomy might mean for cities, and that we actually might use it to bring back the things that we care about and love and protect the things that we care about in cities. But there are, questions about what will the role of the street light in the future be? Will you even need a street light in the future? How will goods movement function both on the ground and in the air? And what do we really value in our cities in terms of equity and quality of life? And how are we going to reassert our role to regulate those things?
Well, why don't we have Justin, why don't you pipe in on that one, because that has been the private sector pressure to kind of move and advance these new technologies and kind of pushing on the public realm. Last year, I think Ford had a discussion about the future of cities and streets, and the most innovative group was Domino's, because they want to figure out how they're going to be able to get cut through traffic and deliver your pizza within that delivery timeline. And so whether it's UPS, really Domino's, Amazon, obviously, but the conversation was about how the private industry can really move and accelerate things. So maybe from your perspective at Uber, what do you think about public rights of way and how that's affecting your niche?
Yeah, so I think Salita has articulated some of the big trends that are coming with AVs, and I think what's happening with technology and the companies that are looking to get involved there is enabling a lot more mobility of both people and goods. So Amazon, you can now have anything delivered in under 2 hours in certain places. Companies like Uber are trying to enable you to move away from a personal car ownership, and autonomous vehicles will drive the price of that mobility down, and that's a good thing, but it will also increase likely the demand for these sorts of things. So you have more packets of people and things moving through this infrastructure, and so that will become a continuing important challenge to overcome in cities that are growing increasingly dense. And so I think what that means is cities and the community we'll all need to come together to figure out how to make the most efficient use of our roadways and our curbs. And so I think we as a company are excited going forward to try and figure out what that looks like. We're exploring curb pilots in a few cities about how we can think about repurposing parking to pick up and drop off, trying to figure out better, safer drop-off zones to help reduce congestion. And I think more generally, think that pricing will be an effective mechanism to help create the right incentives both on the road and for parking. And so I think all of this though will require a good collaboration with the private sector companies and the public sector who are thinking about these dynamics.
And just to be clear, you're talking curb pricing. You're talking pricing of all the public facilities.
I think it's road pricing, congestion pricing. How do we create incentives so we're trying to get more shared rides on the roads? And then I think it's also looking at how, for so long, we have underpriced parking. Like Donald Shoup, the high cost of free parking. Like I think we need to think about not encouraging lots of people to drive their own cars and park on parking spots, and instead think about what are better, higher uses of the curb.
Okay. And as a Shoupista, UCLA, Don Shoup is the author of The High Cost of Parking. And so one of the things, I know, Vince, you and I discussed this, is how can we ensure and kind of protect the public realm and public facilities, particularly in terms of planning. You're kind of on the front end of all this stuff, and how are you in planning, now that you're actually updating the general plan, you're dealing with a bunch of community plans, these are right now on the street, you're dealing with this. How are you guys looking at it from the planning perspective?
Well, so if you look at autonomous vehicles and let's say the passenger part of it, not the goods movement part of it, if there is a certain amount of convenience and accessibility to it, I think everyone's assuming that there will be a big reduction in personal ownership of cars, right? Doesn't mean everyone will give up their car. I always think that when you look at technology, some ways is you can look way back in the past to sometimes see the future. You think about it, in late 1800s, early 1900s, if you're in a city, I mean, most people didn't have a personal way to get around, except unless you're really wealthy, you had your own way to get around. Or if you lived out in the countryside out of necessity. So I think there's always going to be a reason for some people to own an autonomous vehicle, but they're going to be greatly reduced, and it's going to be about choice and lifestyle. And so if you see this reduction in the need for parking spaces, they're going to be reduced to, I would imagine it could be reduced to a point where we can start making some decisions about where do the parking spaces go, as a broader sense as a public, because you may have, companies who own the rideshare services that are providing, or if you will, the autonomous vehicle services that are in essence rideshare throughout the cities, and so kind of who owns those collective spaces? I mean, I think that's a fundamental question we're going to have to ask ourselves. Maybe it goes to the private sector. Maybe the public sector wants to be in that business, because you're going to, at the end of the day, it doesn't mean, even with the rideshare services where we have the spaces, and if you have your autonomous vehicle company that's going to be providing these services, you're still going to need to park those cars. You're still going to need to distribute them throughout the city. So government's still going to need a role in terms of deciding where these spaces are, how the flow of traffic goes, and so forth. And so you kind of have to even look past that. If you look at the old photos when we first had vehicles, and there was no intersections really weren't regulated. There weren't stoplights. It was actually, I think the Auto Club was one of the first ones who actually regulated it. So we have to kind of think about that. So that kind of all comes together, and when you look at the spaces, and I think we will have to make a fundamental decision about whether we want to be in the parking business or not, or we'll leave that up to the private sector. And then once we make that decision, a lot will flow from there in terms of how we will be forming the cities in the future. Well,
and carry that thought just one more step into the end of personalized parking. I mean, that's what I think is what we discussed, and the thought of us, the one for every car, there's 4 parking spots, miserable story, but the situation is now completely on its head, right? So maybe we don't have individual parking. Maybe there is a life where parking isn't the paramount consideration when we're doing a project or development. And so in planning, and that's the reason why how are you right now in the middle of that?
Right, and so what we're looking at is what happens when cars are no longer the necessity they are today in Los Angeles. And so you start looking around the city and how our city can be very different. I think that, the first thing, if any architect or developer will tell you, the very first thing they do when they look at a development project is to determine how much parking they need, either by code or by just the market demand and what they need. That's the very first thing they do. And that drives the design of pretty much almost every project that you have, largely today in Southern California. And the cost.
And the cost, yeah.
Because the cost really drives it. So once you do that, there is property all over the city that was just not developable because of the parking requirements that now will be. And so it's going to be very interesting. We're going to be able to allow for things to change in neighborhoods where they weren't allowed to change before. I think that you're going to see that throughout the whole city in terms of whether a lot is buildable, but also if most vehicles are then now owned by rideshare services, you no longer need to drive down the street and see the gas station to use or see the tire repair. So these things will also, as well as the parking being, if you will, centralized, so will the auto services. So you're going to open up so much of our streets that we see today in Los Angeles are things that have lots of opportunities. And what's nice about not doing the parking is you can design buildings that are much more in sync with the neighborhood around them if you don't have to worry about the parking.
No, I'm, believe me, as a recovering real estate developer, I am 100% with you on that. It always was the driver, like how much does each of these stalls cost us? And by extension, the tenant or the homeowner. So Melanie, let's get to the whole issue of, I think what Vince is painting is a very interesting photo of the future, right? But that photo is complicated by possibly, how are autonomous vehicles going to affect our overall quality of life, our environmental conditions. I mean, there's a little bit of the dystopia versus nirvana. Are we going to live in dystopia, or are we going to have so many of these little autonomous bots and dots that we can't get around? So, what does that mean, and what's your experience in San Francisco with this?
Sure. And right now it's really the regulatory Wild West. It could go either direction. And that's why I think it's really interesting, the utopian vision that Salida laid out, but there's also the dystopian vision where you have autonomous vehicles that are still fossil fuel powered that might not either have a driver or a passenger circulating around cities, and that could greatly increase VMTs, greatly increase carbon emission reductions. So I think what Salida was talking about in terms of the city being able to have a role to put in place the policies, the regulations, the requirements to incentivize and ensure that we don't go towards that dystopian future is going to be really critical. Of course, as I think all of you know, greenhouse gas emissions in California, about 40% of those emissions do come from transportation. So this is a sector that we need to continue to address to ensure that we can reach some of these ambitious carbon emission reduction goals. We heard yesterday about trying to reach a 80% reduction by 2050. So this is really a critical area. So the other issue that right now the San Francisco Department of the Environment is looking at is right now getting electric vehicle infrastructure into buildings, whether it's homes or office buildings, today is very challenging. Mm-hmm. So if we want to see a future where autonomous vehicles are all electric, we really do need to solve the problem of charging infrastructure and figuring out how to make that more seamless, cost-effective, and required potentially.
Yeah, go ahead, Justin.
Can I just add on? I think that what is exciting about this potential world is when you move to a fleet model and the utilization goes up substantially, the economics start to make a little more sense for EVs. And so there is a real opportunity there, but you're totally right, though, that it can only work with the infrastructure that enables that. So we've basically got this trend if we can get the infrastructure right, and I'm struck by many years ago when I was trying to bike around the city, when I was in New York, and I found it hard sometimes to lock up my bike to anything but a pole. And it actually started to disincentivize my desire to bike at the time because I was having trouble locking it up safely. So it just strikes me that even when the trends are right, you need the supporting infrastructure. And so it's great when cities or states are leading on this sort of thing, because I think companies want to get there if we can.
But I mean, so this is the limiting factor, right? Is that we're putting all these charging stations in the bottom of apartment buildings and stuff like this, and so the infrastructure is limiting. And I think yesterday, one of the discussions, a city official was saying, why are we putting it in places where you can't get to? They have to be publicly accessible, and some of those things are shifting. I really want to address this other kind of looming issue of transit. We, as Phil was speaking about, and those in Los Angeles County, we've made a huge investment in transit expansion of our networks, and we are taking a big dive into that. And one of the issues is how are we looking at the future of transit with this technology of autonomous vehicles introducing themselves. And so I'm looking at Salida, like, help us see what the future looks like, and how is that balance or not a balance going to happen?
Yeah, no problem. Future of transit, got it. So, and I say that tongue in cheek, but it's a serious issue.
It's a serious,
right? 20% decline in ridership in Los Angeles over the last 5 years, right as we're about to embark or continue to embark on the largest capital expansion of subway and light rail in North America. Tremendous promise to the voters that we have to fulfill. And we want those trains to go where people need them, to be well used, to organize our city, to incentivize, infill development, thoughtful infill development that doesn't displace people, right? We have a lot of ambitions around that program, but I think the arrival of private mobility companies that are starting businesses on public streets, not sharing data and not collaborating with cities, has been tremendously sort of challenging for transit providers. In a healthy way, I think, although there are a lot of frustrations. I think the tension between what companies like Uber and Lyft have sort of demonstrated, which is that people don't want to drive. Even in Los Angeles, this joy of driving myth is, people are sort of way over it. And even more so, they don't want to park, right? Which is,
And they don't want to pay for the parking.
and they don't want to, right, they don't want to do any of those things. In my neighborhood, when I speak to the business owners with valets, they say, well, I come in and I think that the restaurant's going to be dead because the parking lot's empty, the valets are not busy, and it's slammed because people are using these other choices. So how the challenge for public transit is to flip over a lot of sacred cows that we have had about 40-foot-long fixed route transit, which does not work in large swaths of the city, serves people very poorly. People who depend on it as a lifeline service. Don't even get me started on paratransit, which is even sadder and more depressing for people who need it even more. The arrival of Uber and Lyft has sort of sparked us to rethink how we do things. Do I think that means that we need to allow private mobility companies to take over the role of the public in providing public transit as a public good? No, I don't. And so I think there is an urgency for public leaders and departments of transportation to really think about how we fund transit, how we deliver transit, and whether or not we need to directly employ transit operators or we need to be concessioners of public transit. And the public transit fleet of the future should be everything from an electric bike share bike up to articulated bus rapid transit line and light rail and subway. But to get there from here, we have to lay out a very different vision. And we also have to lower the procurement hurdles. I think that is the single biggest thing standing between us, both the color of money that we receive and how limiting it is for how we fund transit, and then also being able to quickly iterate and work with and partner and invest in private mobility providers. And you're starting to see some of those partnerships emerge. Metro has partnerships. DOT is working on partnerships. Agencies across the country are working on those things and learning and failing and learning again. And that's really what's going to be required to get there. But we in the public sector have to really rethink things. And that's not typically the business that we're in. I would also argue, though, that the private sector needs to recognize how valuable we are as a partner and start to really come to the table to build trust in a relationship so that we can get there. Because I think that everybody on this panel has said there's this utopian convergence of electric, autonomous, and shared is highly unlikely. It is more likely that we are going to get it wrong, that two of those are going to converge and one of them isn't going to show up. And the public sector is where we can change that. If we can be activist investors, we're Los Angeles, we can move markets if we rethink the investments that we're making in public transit, and if we can get some real private companies to come to the table in genuine partnership.
So Justin, do we have private partners in the market? Because that's one of the biggest issues is like I don't think Uber or any of the other providers are interested in killing public transit. I think there is a responsibility from the private sector to partner with the public entities to say, okay, let's figure this out so that we do have multiple options for people. So how is Uber thinking about transit and its role in helping the public sector continue to provide these services?
Yes, I just want to confirm the record. We do not want to kill public transit.
I know.
Okay. Confirmed. Yeah, so it's a great question. I think, so first of all, what we're trying to tackle is reducing the need for car ownership. And I think if we look at a lot of the maps of where we've grown and the sort of expanse at which we've grown, there is a clear sign that people, I think, are willing to move away from that, and I think that's sort of what we're focused on. I think it does create some challenges to navigate around how to integrate with public transit, and I think that's definitely top of mind to us. We have made a few, probably many at this point, public-private partnerships across the country. And I think on some level, cities are heterogeneous, and so how that looks in each city is very different, both from the size and the density, but also the sort of sophistication or newness of the company, or sorry, the city that is providing that transit. So I think we have someone on our policy team who works with me, who leads a lot of these transit relationships, and I think we're trying to figure out what exactly that looks like. And I think, you know, if states are laboratories of experimentation, then cities, I guess, are mini labs. But I think we're exploring lots of different ones, and I think certainly going forward it will be continually a focus for us. And I think Salida brings up, I think one of the big things that I've observed both in government and now here is, I think a key to all of that is improving the procurement process. I think there's I can imagine a lot of products that companies could build or services to provide if procurement was much more streamlined. And I know when I was on the government side trying to get companies to work with me, I could only get a limited few who had already figured out how to navigate that procurement process. Mm-hmm. So we either need to sort of come together to streamline procurement or figure out alternative vehicles or public-private partnership approaches where we can be a little bit more nimble.
But I think the city, we need to have public money in the game. There
Right.
needs to be skin in the game from the public sector in order to get the outcomes that we want and get the information and insight that we want.
Well, the private sector is at really the mercy of the public sector to set the regulatory framework. So if the cities set up that framework and say, under these rules and these guys, you get to put your technology out on the streets, that to me, and there's a partnership there, that to me is where we want to go. But I don't see that. I think we're getting there, but I don't see.
Well, I think at the federal and state level, intentionally cities have been preempted from doing that. Mm-hmm. We literally have been robbed of our regulatory oversight. In October, the Federal Aviation Administration exerted regulatory authority down to the blade of grass in front of your house. Prior to that, it had been, above, 10,000 feet, you have to use instruments. Below 400 feet, just don't hit anything. But now, Amazon Air, Walmart Air, Uber Taxi, all of those services that are going to be coming very fast are going to be regulated by a federal agency. And unless cities can sort of figure out and be articulate about the things we care about and that we want to retain regulatory authority over, we are going to continue to be preempted because there is just massive lobbying pressure at the federal level to remove cities from that role in the name of innovation. And so I think it's gonna be really, really challenging to get there.
And I think it is really critical that cities do have the ability to put those regulations and policies in place. Short of that, I do know that there are a number of cities that are putting principles in place to start the conversation about what's required for testing innovative technologies. So for instance, the San Francisco County Transportation Authority put in their plan 10 guiding principles for how they would determine what technologies can be tested. And just recently, the National League of Cities did a survey of transportation plans from around the country and found that only 6% had any language at all about autonomous vehicles or new technologies and how that would be assessed in the emergence of mobility trends. So that's another thing to consider, is that cities do need to act now, even without the ability to put all the regulations in place.
Mm-hmm.
Chairman, one other thought you mentioned around sort of cities and the regulatory structure, and I think there's a behavioral economics and political challenge that we probably haven't totally acknowledged, which is it's harder to change existing systems, it's easier to change new ones. And so there's like a feeling of like, oh, for the new entrants, be they rideshare or be they AVs, let's focus on regulating that because it's harder to tackle direct personal car ownership of existing vehicles. And I think we as a company are excited about or support regulatory systems that affect the whole system. with existing personal car ownership. I think what we tend to worry about sometimes is when people start talking about regulating new types of things without thinking about the old stuff, and then it ends up disincentivizing what we think are potential opportunities and still sort of lifting up or enabling the existing single car internal combustion engine private vehicle being driven by one person. And so I think as long as we think of these regulatory systems and sort of its overall impact, I think it's a great thing.
Well, my only concern is that once that cat gets out of that bag, it's out, and it's really hard to pull it back. And so I think that's why a lot of cities and agencies are trying to say, okay, here, let's kind of, as I think Melanie was saying, let's put something there so that at least you understand what our values and priorities and principles are as a city, as a jurisdiction, versus going and landing in a community and saying, okay, now you go figure it out because we're private, right? And that's the thing where I innovation, creativity, all in the name of, but do you want tunnels underneath your streets, under, public right-of-ways? That's what's next, right? So those are the issues that I think our cities are dealing with front and center. That's the thing that I'm mentioning. And so maybe, Vince, before, if there's any questions, we'll probably have time for maybe one or two questions. Vince, so, Mr. Planning Director, I think there has been no, and I'm an adjunct professor at USC and UCLA, both. I don't pick sides. But needless to say, there is no better time to be a planner. I think this is the most exciting and dynamic time, and in particularly Los Angeles and Southern California writ large, but it is so exciting to be a planner because at no other time did we have more money than God. I mean, Vince, remember we had no money.
Right.
And so now we can do things and we can actually be the front end. And so in terms of, Vince, where you sit in front of 36 plans to update, a general plan to redo, how do you create that framework allowing for flexibility in those plans for those new ideas that we can't even imagine, right? We can't even see what that looks like. How are you going to do that, and still, how do we contain our quality of life within our neighborhoods?
Right. Some big questions.
It is. That's why I give it to you.
But you said that, and those are great questions because, and like you said, I don't think we've ever in a long time been confronted with such potential change as we have right now. But also at the same time, we've been provided with resources, right? If you look at what's happened in terms of our investment in infrastructure and rail and the airport and everything like that. So we have a lot of potential for this. And what you said is trying to predict. Fundamentally, we're trying to predict several things, but a primary one is just behavior and how people will behave in the future. And that's very difficult. We always have hit it right. Remember, if you live in Pasadena, the Arroyo Seco Parkway, originally, I think they paved the streets, the two lanes different colors because they figured that people would not switch lanes. Because if you said one was blacktop and the other was cement, so if you would just stay in the same color. They were trying to predict behavior, and they were, of course, completely wrong on that because people weave around our freeways and parkways all the time. So I think that's the thing that we're trying to do that we won't be very perfect at, of trying to predict future behavior. But what we can do is really talk about change and being adaptive to change and look at it from a continuum standpoint. I look at where we're moving in technology, and this is part of a larger continuum in terms of technology for me, which from a city planning standpoint is doing several things, but one of them is people are fundamentally getting detached from place. The necessity to be in a certain place at a certain time is now becoming more and more irrelevant. And if you look at what's happening with autonomous vehicles, that's allowing this mobility of freedom to move around anytime, any place within our region that we've never had before. So what does that mean? You add that on to what we do with things besides the sharing economy and information and communication and things like, if you look at our neighborhoods, I don't think that it's not unusual that as Salita mentioned, this issue of displacement and gentrification and that why it's so such a concern today. But if you think about today, what we do, a few things happen today that we didn't have happen 5-10 years ago. Right now, if I want to get from one place to another, I will just hit on Waze, and I'll go a route I've never been before, right? And I'm getting introduced to all these places in LA, which I've lived in for almost 30 years. that I've never seen before. An amazing little street. So, wow, that's a really cool little street. Now, at the same time,
Those neighbors have a few words for you about
They-
They hate
using
ways.
Oh.
They
their
hate
streets.
ways.
They do. And my neighbors also have very words,
I
same words
know
for the
they
people
do.
driving down my street too. But as we see that, then all of a sudden, you get on an app like Redfin or Trulia, and then you start to see, oh, well, this is how much a place costs. And so what you start to do is it's very different. Angelinos are starting to get introduced to different neighborhoods than they've never been introduced before. The cost of housing and movement is more expensive than it used to be. So people are more willing to to move out of their comfort zone of where they are. But there's just this overall, I think, continuum about getting detached from a place. Like when I was a kid, if you wanted to talk to someone, you had to physically be at that telephone attached to the wall. A big innovation was the one where the handset got to move around, wireless handset. But it was all about how long you get that cord. Cordless, thank you.
Cordless.
But it was all about, when I was a kid, it was how long you get that cord so you can maybe get around the corner in the other room, but you can get away from your family.
Right.
Now this whole idea of communication is completely, where you are is irrelevant. So I think that plays itself out in where we live and how we live. I think it plays itself out in where we work and how we work. Where we go for recreation, what recreation is. I think we blended together with communication and the sharing economy and everything. Your house for a while, your house now could be your office and your workplace, which it wasn't really like that before. It could be a business, it could be a hotel. There's that place somewhere on the east side where he sells burgers out of his backyard. Burgers Never Say Die. That place, which you can get on Twitter, and you can have a whole business. You can make your house a restaurant now, and a place for recreation. So I think Angelinos are fundamentally looking at their homes differently, and I think as part of that, place is being looked at differently. So getting back to your question, it's kind of the answer to the question is part of your question, which is really we have to make sure our plans they won't be able to accurately predict how people are going to behave and what the place will look like, but it has to be adaptable. Our plans have to be adaptable, and they have to allow for the fluidity of where the future is going to go, and change is going to happen very rapidly.
The
from
rate
time
of
to
change
time.
is much faster. Thank you for that. We have time probably for one question, but maybe also, panelists, if you kind of can think about your closing thoughts as we have one sole council member, Vice Mayor from Culver City, Tom Small. But think about closing thoughts. One of the things I do want to put on the table is that everyone from 14 to 94 can now get around, and there's all this latent demand that is kind of rearing its head, and we're feeling it, we're seeing it. And so that's the new world we're going to live in, that there's so much more opportunity, and yet there's so much more pressure on our systems. Vice Mayor Tom Small, if you don't mind the only question.
So how should we think about letting the Boring Company tunnel under our streets? They presented to us last Monday and are going to be asking for permits. And sort of more broadly, having dozens of little electric scooters lying all over our sidewalks. How are we going to approach those things? You guys hinted at that, and I need the suggestions.
I hear Santa Monica's got similar issues. I mean, it's a lot of cities where these scooters that really actually you should have a license to use them. I mean, they're all over the place. Does anybody want to take a shot at that?
Well, I would just say that, and I would never presume to, I think Culver City is a fantastic place and extremely well-run, and I think that you guys do a fantastic job with all of your policies and very forward-looking. But I would say, one of the things that we did about a year ago is release sort of something called Urban Mobility in a Digital Age, which laid out very clearly what our vision is of the future with all of these kinds of technologies and technology companies as a way of helping us filter and screen all of the opportunities that are coming our way, because they are opportunities, but we have limited resources, and every single one of those folks that wants to pilot their new thing on your street will require your city staff resources to go make sure that it's safe, make sure that it's equitable, make sure that it meets all of the things that you care about as a city. And so the next thing we're doing is releasing a mobility bill of rights, which we've sort of created. We even have a card game to help get input on what people really care about. And we're trying to sort of protect our vision of the future and kind of the principles that we have as a city. And I think if you start thinking about asking questions of those companies that are coming to you, just to pick a random example, somebody who wants to build a tunnel for private cars under our streets, and say, who is this tunnel for, and who will it serve, and how many people will it serve? And if your whole plan is to have private vehicles pull up, queue on my city streets that I manage and operate, and sit there while they wait to be put in an elevator and then zoomed from very wealthy neighborhoods to the airport, then have we really met an equity goal here? Or are there things that we really want to see before we are going to allow literally the ground under our feet to be used as a laboratory in that way? It gives you a framework from which to ask difficult questions. And, you know, if our goal is to get to a 50-50 mode split of single occupant, non-single occupant vehicles, we know what happens when we build capacity for single occupant vehicles in our cities. More people drive. So I'm sorry, but this particular proposal doesn't actually move us towards this other goal. If you have another proposal, we are interested in hearing it. But, you know, the reason why those tunnels are inexpensive is because they are small. And does that meet our goals for things like fire life safety, where we need redundancy and ventilation and ways for first responders to get in and out, right? Those kinds of questions, I think, are necessary because protecting the public right-of-way is such a tremendous responsibility. And there is so much pressure when, you know, a very large personality, approaches you with a very big idea. But I do think it's necessary to sort of have a framework from which you can ask difficult questions. And I would say the same about the scooters. You know, no, we're not opposed to you providing more mobility options on our streets, but here are our principles about pedestrian safety, ADA, and walkability. And if you are all over the sidewalk or adding to a safety issue, well, then I'm sorry, but we need to go back to the drawing board to make sure that we bring you in alignment. And are you providing fares that are open and accessible to everybody? And where's your equity plan for how you're going to serve everybody in this community and not just the wealthiest among us?
Just a simple question, Vice Mayor. I appreciate that one. But thank you. I think it's a real issue because if it's not, you know, one city, it's another city dealing with these things, and it's important to have the tools to be able to respond. So maybe in closing, because I want to be mindful of our time, just the thoughts about autonomous vehicles and the way we think about cities. Maybe we'll start with Melanie and just your thoughts, your closing thoughts on what this means.
Sure. So I do have to give Councilmember O'Day from Santa Monica credit for ACES, which is Autonomous, Connected, Electric, and Shared. So that's sort of the utopian vision. I think that's a great way to think about what are all the pieces that need to come together for the utopian future that we want to see with autonomous vehicles. And I would just say that if there are cities in the room, government officials in the room, the message, I think, is really that the time is now to be proactive, even with some of the limitations to being able to put regulations in place. There are a lot of things that cities can do to be proactive about advancing your values and your principles to ensure that autonomous vehicles are part of a solution for everybody and can address both equity and climate goals.
So I think it's a potentially very exciting time. Reduction in transportation costs and mobility, increased access can be huge drivers of economic development, and we see this throughout history. It has some potential risks to it that we need to be pretty aware of. And if you look at what those risks are, particularly around congestions, things like that, they're the same risks that we've seen for decades. Carpooling peaked in like 1980. And so when you start thinking about solutions to those risks, a lot of those have been in the discussion for a long time as well. So we should really ask, why have we not been able to solve those so far? what will it take to come together to come up with new solutions to actually make this happen. And I imagine a lot of this is nonprofits, the private sector, and forward-thinking city leaders coming together to figure out how to actually implement things like congestion pricing to make sure that we can get this utopia that Melanie was just talking about.
Yeah, I think to sort of segue off of segues, remember those? Remember when we were all going to be writing those? I just want everybody to write. Everybody chill out, because AVs are one, but remember segues? Like that was going to be the thing. Anyway, I do think that to Justin's point, we do have to have a real conversation about managing demand, and that has to come from the private side, because it can't come from government talking about decongestion fees or congestion pricing or whatever we're going to talk about. But none of these other things that we're going to provide are ever going to be as effective as we would like them to be until we have that discussion. And I think that is an opportunity for real dialogue between the public and private sectors. I'm actually optimistic about our ability to overcome some of the procurement hurdles. We just went through a process to pre-clear companies to come work for us, manufacturers, software companies, data companies, and we had over 100 of them go through the process with us, including companies like Ford and General Motors, that we can now work with over the next 3 years without having to go through RFPs. So there are definitely ways to go about that. And the last thing I want to put on the table is something we have not talked about a lot, which is privacy. So as your vehicle becomes a data collection machine, who will be able to opt in and out of having all of your data collected, shared, and monetized? Because I want you to think about a lot of these companies not as mobility companies, but as data companies. And the value of your data and who gets to share and who gets to keep their data, privacy as a luxury, is not something that we're having enough of a conversation about, that I have a lot of concerns about as we sort of gaze into the future of autonomous vehicles.
I would just say real quick, it's going to be, for me, about behavior and how behavior really dictates how we experience our city, and how we experience our city really dictates how we want to use it. We're going to be using, I think I said this past, autonomous vehicles means we're going to be passengers all the time, right? We're not going to be drivers anymore. We're going to experience the city as a passenger, which many of us as Angelinos don't do, So we're going to be experiencing a city differently when we're in the autonomous vehicles, and that behavior is going to probably change how we want to see our city change and evolve. And also parts of our city that we're never going to be, because of the parking space issue, where personal parking spaces will be greatly reduced, if not go away. We're going to have parts of our city that are now going to be, people are going to be able to develop that you would never be able to do before, ever. And so how we do that has a lot of potential benefit, but also it's going to be tricky. We're going to have to figure out how to look at those spaces that have largely not been seen as spaces for people to actually have people in them.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you very much for a great conversation and dialogue. Thank you very much, and appreciate you attending our session. Thank you.